Committee Room
and Constitutional Affairs Committee. Today the committee is holding a session into the work of the Cabinet Office, and we are joined by the Cabinet Office's Permanent Secretary, Sir Alex Chisholm, as well as its Chief Operating Officer and Chief Financial Officer. And we're going to be covering matters including the Cabinet Office's expenditure and administration, and examining issues such as civil service pay, staff turnover, and Cabinet Office spending generally. We also hope to be able to explore Sir Alex's reflections from his time at the Cabinet Office ahead of his departure from the role. Good morning to all of you. Could I ask Sir Alex, please, to introduce yourself for the record?
Thank you very much, Chair. Good to see you all again. Alex Chisholm, Permanent Secretary, Cabinet Office and Civil Service Chief Operating Officer.
Hello, and I'm Sarah Harrison, Chief Operating Officer of the Cabinet Office.
Good morning, Chair, Committee. I'm Richard Hornby. I'm the Chief Financial Officer of the Cabinet Office.
Thank you. Now, Sir Alex, this is almost certainly, you'll be relieved to know, your last appearance at this committee before you move on from the Cabinet Office. And I want to give you the opportunity to reflect on your time in the role. What have been your biggest frustrations, and what would you say that you're most proud of?
Thank you very much, Chair, and it's nice to have the opportunity to appear in front of the committee, and thank you for that first question. I think I joined in April 2020, and of course the most striking thing about that is that we were already in a lockdown situation and the pandemic was all around us, and that is very different, obviously, to the context to which I had imagined when I first thought of joining the Cabinet Office. So it has been quite a tumultuous period. When I look back on it, I think the thing which I am most proud of is, first of all, the people in the Cabinet Office and the way in which working in this time of extensive change and pressure, from EU exit to COVID to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, handling exceptional events such as COP26, the G7 summit, the funeral, the coronation, all of these pressures, all of these events, I think brilliantly handled by colleagues in the Cabinet Office, and I'm delighted to have the chance to recognise and thank them for that service. In my other role as Civil Service Chief Operating Officer, I think the things that I think will make the longest or the biggest difference over time are, first of all, the improvements in the performance of the whole government system in relation to digital, where we've done a lot of remediating of legacy systems, a lot of investment in data and the capabilities of our own people and digital skills. I'm really pleased that we launched the Public Sector Fraud Authority, which has been very effective in detecting and helping to eliminate fraud and error. And I'm delighted by the success, which I know that PACAC has been very interested in as well, from your visit to Glasgow, our second headquarters there. Our ability as a civil service to be really UK-wide and to be very visible and effective and serving the communities across the whole of the UK.
Thank you. You mentioned, obviously, your other role as Civil Service Chief Operating Officer. Now, do you think that is a role that is sufficiently empowered to affect change across departments?
Yes, I think so. It's always interesting, the difference between a sort of power in the sense of hard power, levers and controls, versus, if you like, influence that can come from persuasion and expertise. And I think we try and use a mix of those two. There are firm levers and controls. We have hard controls, as you know, on things like procurement and on property and on digital standards. Major projects have to go through lots of stages of kind of assessment and approval to get support. But I think actually a lot of the good we do doesn't just come from a hard control, a kind of you can't do it or setting conditions. It also comes from giving people access to fantastic expertise. We now have 150,000 people across the civil service are members of one of the professional functions. That's an incredible amount of expertise. Nearly all of that, of course, in departments, only about 4,000 of those in the Cabinet Office, but we kind of preside over that functional system. I think that has really helped bring a lot of efficiency and delivery to the government effort.
What are your thoughts on Lord Maud's recommendation for an externally recruited civil service head, if I can describe it as that, with perhaps greater authority to implement reform?
I think I'm strongly in favour of open and fair competition. It is the standard we've practiced in civil service for a very long time. I've myself always gone through those processes for the various roles that I've held. And I think probably more than ever today it is a benefit, because government work is important work, it's challenging work, and we need access to the very best talent the whole economy can give. Some of that will be, if you like, grown within the civil service, and some of that's going to come from the private sector, from local government, and from the third sector. The committee might be interested to know we've actually done an analysis now of the backgrounds of the top roughly 240 people in the central government system, permanent secretaries and directors general who appear in front of committees regularly. I think 45% of those have either come directly from outside or joined the senior civil service from outside and then have been promoted internally. So there's actually quite a lot of diversity of experience and background, and I think that's been a real source of strength. That said, whether that is the most important consideration for the very top job, the Cabinet Secretary, Head of Civil Service, you definitely would need to have a very good understanding of the working of the machinery of government to do that job very well. You need to be very good, I think, at winning and holding the trust of political leaders, obviously a rather critical part of that role. So, it won't be for me to decide in any future competition, but I think overall, open and fair competition is good. Whether it's ideal for that role is not for me to decide, it'd be for the Prime Minister.
And if you'll forgive my ignorance, in terms of the successor,
yes,
could you describe their to you in your role? Could you describe their background? Because I believe they've been recruited.
Yes, indeed. So I said that when I applied back in early 2020, that was a competition for that process, and that was also true when I announced in November that I would be concluding my 4-year term. Very shortly, the government announced an open competition for that. We had applicants from outside and internally. That went through a whole load of the usual kind of assessments and panel interviews and what have you. And the panel made a recommendation to the Prime Minister for who should take that role on, and that was accepted by the Prime Minister, who has agreed to the appointment of Cat Little, currently Second Permanent Secretary at the Treasury. Her background within government, before she was in the Treasury as Second Permanent Secretary, she was Director General for Public Expenditure. Before that, she was in the Ministry of Defence in a senior financial role there, and also in the Ministry of Justice in a top role there. So quite a lot of experience within the government system, but again, like me, she had worked, and indeed both my colleagues here, she'd worked outside of the civil service, and she had been a qualified accountant with one of the major firms there, and did work with them as well. I should say I'm absolutely delighted with her appointment. She will be a fantastic successor, so very pleased to be handing the baton over to her.
And we look forward to welcoming her before this committee in due course, of course. Blunt question, really. Is the Cabinet Office an effective centre of government?
I would say yes. In my time it has been effective, but obviously it depends really on the assessment of the ministers we serve and the public we serve more than those of us who are in the midst of it. I have felt that given the particular circumstances that we have faced, we've dealt well with the multiple challenges that I described at the beginning, around EU exit, COVID, and in the geostrategic era with war in Europe. But also I think the hard work of grinding out efficiency, we have really pushed forward with that. We've doubled down on the functional agenda. We were able, you probably saw we just announced £4.4 billion in audited savings, much more in unaudited savings. That's direct savings, of which I think over £3 billion of that was cashable. So that's been a terrific achievement. I think the ability of the Cabinet Office to flex, to move where the need is most, is very striking. When I arrived, we were just in the process of absorbing what had been a separate department. The department for exiting the EU was being absorbed into the Cabinet Office. We then very quickly went through the gears, and I think 6 weeks after I started, we set up the COVID task force, which grew to about 380 people, from more or less from scratch over the next few weeks. So we've had to be extremely flexible at dealing with different challenges that come in from being at the nerve centre of government and of being effectively HQ for government.
In that respect, and I'm going to push you slightly more, and I realise the position you're currently occupying, and maybe some hesitancy in perhaps providing as candid an answer as you might wish. What are the faults and failings of the Cabinet Office?
I think that our harshest critics would probably say that we try.
What about you? Because you've been there at the top of
Yeah.
at the top of it for that time, and I really want to give you the opportunity. I don't want you to dish dirt and so forth. That's not the point. But it's really just to get a sort of critical reflection from you about where you see its challenges.
Thank you, and I wouldn't do that. You're right. What I would say is that we try and do probably too many things. And if you look at the span of the Cabinet Office, we've got around 40 different business units. We've got people working in the Cabinet Office who are experts in property development, people who are doing huge procurements, a great commercial background, people who are constitutional experts, people who are working on the Office of Veteran Affairs. Wherever you look across the Cabinet Office, you see terrific heterogeneity, and that means that as a department, it's can be quite difficult to manage, sometimes to work in and to have a strong identity, because we're trying to do so many things. If you try and do so many things, it's difficult to be sure you're doing everything to the best possible standard.
And you highlight a few there. So would those functions not be better off in other departments? Is it a sense that the Prime Minister of the day's particular fancies drive how big the Cabinet Office becomes, or is it because it can be best managed by the Cabinet Office?
I think it's a mixture of prime ministerial priorities, the circumstances you'll find yourselves in, and that efficiency type argument. So taking each of those, obviously, if you go back to the Cameron era, it was at that time when the decision to set up a National Security Council was set up, and the National Security Secretariat was kind of centred within the Cabinet Office. Some of those responsibilities had previously been done in what was then the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence. So that, obviously, is an example of prime ministerial preference. Circumstances much bigger than fancies, I would say. It wasn't fancy that caused us to set up the COVID task force. It was need, and driven by external circumstances. And again, we've made a huge effort to try and deal with the consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, both from a point of view of helping Ukraine, but also the knock-on effects on energy and cost of living and so on. So those are very much driven by circumstance. I think there is clearly a strong argument for trying to consolidate in one place services which previously were done 24 times over in different Whitehall departments. In some cases are now, used to be done across 300 or 400 public bodies and are now done once really well. So having a government recruitment service which does 70% of the recruitment for the whole of the civil service, having one place, a kernel of expertise for property and for commercial services and for digital services makes huge argument. I think it will be a matter of the taste of a future Prime Minister or this Prime Minister and of future leaders of the Cabinet Office, whether all of that needs to be done in the Cabinet Office itself.
Could I just ask quick thoughts on the splitting of the Secretariat and corporate functions into different departments? What's your view generally on that?
I think the bringing them together in one place obviously has a number of benefits to it, particularly allowing the deep expertise that's within the functions to be brought to bear to shape policy and to ensure that it's well delivered. Also making sure that the large and important work of functions are subject to proper political direction and well aligned.
Yes.
The disbenefit is that clearly trying to do all of those things in a single entity, there's about 10,000 people in the Cabinet Office and probably around about 6,000 of those are working in those functional areas, and the degree of similarity between what they do and some of what happens in the Secretariat side is less. And as I mentioned, there are costs both for internal, if you like, transactional costs and external identity and reputation for trying to do all the things in one place.
Thank you for that. Just before we move on to one of my colleagues, I have a question here from if you wouldn't mind, your time when you were Permanent Secretary at Bayes. It's a very direct question, topical. Did you sign off the nomination for a CBE for Paula Venables?
Certainly that recommendation would have come through my department at that time, no question. I didn't recall the discussion at the Economy and Honours Committee, and when I asked the Secretary, that said it's because you weren't there, so I missed that particular meeting, so I can't help the committee of understanding that final process.
But as Permanent Secretary, did you or did you not put her name forward?
Not a personal recommendation, but undoubtedly the Post Office Limited as a body under Bayes would have come forward with a recommendation of the sponsoring department.
But you never saw name, or can't recall seeing that name when it went forward?
It would have been on a list of names, a large list of names, and undoubtedly would have come across my desk at that time. Yeah.
Okay. John Stevenson.
Thank you, Chair. Sir Alex, the Cabinet Secretary took leave of absence between October and January, and no temporary Cabinet Secretary was appointed. How was his absence covered, and what impact did it have on you?
Thank you very much for the question. So first of all, it was a kind of a collective effort to try and make sure that during that period of mercifully brief absence, he's back with us now and has been since January, we were able to lean in and share out the responsibilities as best we could. The arrangements that were put in place with the agreement of ministers at the time involved within that share out, for example, the attending cabinet and being the lead person there to kind of record the discussion was done by the Director General for Economic and Domestic Secretariat. Some of the appointments responsibilities, the chair of the Senior Leadership Committee put in an extra effort there. I chaired a lot of the permanent secretary meetings at that time in his absence, so we shared it out in that kind of a way.
Who was head of civil service then during that period?
There was no replacement head of the service appointed. We shared out the responsibilities, and those arrangements worked very effectively.
You never
during
stepped
that
into
time.
his shoes, really?
As I say, a number of people took on different responsibilities. There was no single replacement.
With regards to non-executive directors in the various departments, do they have any value?
I personally am a strong believer, as I know this committee is, in the value that non-executive directors bring. All of the departments I've worked in, and indeed when I was the Competition Markets Authority before, we had a board, and all of those boards have been different, but in all of the cases I think the work of a board in trying to provide kind of good challenge and support to the executive has been invaluable, and also I really appreciate the kind of different experience and an attitude that non-executive directors bring, usually for very small financial rewards as part of their public service, and that has been, a real strengthening of the system, both in central government and I know it's important in many public bodies as well.
You'll be aware of our report and our criticisms, a degree of lack of transparency, personal connections. What do you make of those?
I did read your report and also other ones that have been written by people relevant to this Committee on Standards in Public Life. We've got an NEO report now as a PAC hearing next month on it. I think that the government has agreed with a number of your recommendations. Most importantly, I think the appointment of non-executive directors to boards is now a regulated process, as the committee recommended, and is subject to the oversight of the Commissioners for Public Appointments. We are doing such a recruitment now for our chair of our COARC committee. Again, that's a regulated process. So that's moved from your recommendation to being accepted and adopted by the government. I think you also recommended enhanced transparency, and we have made some changes to the Corporate Governance Code to try and address that. I think in the issue of managing conflicts, the conflicts, I think, are declared, and that is a requirement of people both in the application process and for public bodies to do that in the way they report in the work of their boards. And there's probably even further we can go in that regard, but as you'll have seen from the Commissioner for Public Appointments report at the end of just December 23, actually, there is a very high level of transparency about those appointments, the process in which people are appointed, who are the members of the board, what their backgrounds are, what qualified for them, any external interests. And I think public bodies as a whole are good at recording any mitigations they need to take to deal with any conflicts that arise.
You say they bring great benefit to the department, but recruitment seems to take forever, as has been demonstrated by the report. And 9 of 19 departments have had fewer than 4 meetings in a year. Doesn't demonstrate a great deal of activity by those boards, does it?
I think the recommendation is to have at least 6, and I think that department should be meeting that. We certainly do have more than that. We just came back from a day and a half in Glasgow with our board just last week, and you can see that we have more than 6 meetings a year.
But other departments are clearly failing.
I think that the departments do vary. They do reflect a little bit both the responsibilities of the departments, but also the preferences and choices of the leadership of those departments. And I think if the committee is saying, all departments should hit the standard of 6, I would have to agree with that.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. David Jones, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Sir Alex, I'd like to ask you about the 2023 People's Survey. Is it the case that the results of the survey were circulated to Cabinet Office staff in December?
Mm-hmm.
They've not been published yet?
That is the case, yes.
And as you know, this committee did recommend that they should be published in the year to which they relate. Is there any particular reason why they haven't been published yet?
Thank you very much. And yes, just to recall, in case for other people might not remember all the circumstances, exactly right, that the committee was very recommended that we should treat the People Survey as an official statistic and have it published at the same time as it's made available to staff. Without wishing to re-prosecute it, you remember my view before the committee was that, which is the government's view, is that it is better to share first with staff than prior to publication, and also that it is, rather than official statistic, is actually a piece of management information which we do publish because we recognise there's a public interest in it, but its prime purpose is to help us manage the organisations that we lead. So that remains the case. I think the committee said to have a gap between, a considerable gap between when it's made available to staff and when it's available to Parliament, to the wider public, is you'd like to have that gap as short as possible, and we took that very seriously. And there is I can't yet confirm the exact date, but I think it will be published very, very shortly, and that is partly in consideration of the committee's view that gap should be as short as possible.
Could you give us a flavour of what the results of the survey say in respect to the Cabinet Office?
Yes, I can. I mean, first of all, you'll remember when I was before the committee in January of last year, we were reflecting on what had been quite a poor set of results the year before relative to other departments in the Cabinet Office's own past. It had been a year of exceptional change, and also there was a lot of concern about pay, as you remember, in the context of cost of living pressures. Delighted to share with the committee this morning that we were the biggest improvement of any department in the most recent results, and had a substantial improvement in our engagement scores, and were against all different themes, and particularly delighted that as a place to work in, the number of people who would recommend the Cabinet Office as a great place to work increased by 10 percentage points. We were also the biggest improving department in terms of our leadership and managing change. So I think that is, if you like, evidence of how what I said to you before the committee last year, which is that we took very seriously the People Survey results. We went into a big process of saying, what can we do to make the department work better for the people who work in there? Put together a programme which we call a Better Cabinet Office, with apologies for the slight corniness of the title, and that has clearly been very effective in improving our engagement and morale within the department, which I'm very, very proud of.
Have the results improved in all areas, or have they worsened in some?
I think they are up on all themes. There are an awful lot of questions in the People Survey. There might be one or two which have gone sort of -1, but overall we're substantially ahead, and on all the 9 themes of the People Survey we're ahead. So we're really pleased by that.
You say you're going to publish shortly.
Yes.
Before the end of next month?
I think more shortly than that, I'm hoping. But
at the end of this month?
I can't confirm the precise date yet because it's outside of my control. But I emphasise again, we do recognise what the committee said, and the weight of what you said. Publish as soon as possible after you shared with staff.
Your annual report identified a performance risk relating to the recruitment and retention of staff.
Yes.
Given the results that you've just outlined briefly, is that still a concern?
I think it's always a concern because we want to be able to recruit the very best people we possibly can and to hold on for them for as long as possible. We are quite relaxed about a model where people come into the Cabinet Office for a tour of duty, if you like, bringing particular expertise from a department for a public body and then roll off back to that department or to another area. What we're not relaxed about is people who are at the peak of their skills and employability going off to work elsewhere because they can't hack it, because they're not happy with their work, or because they feel their skills haven't been used or recognised, or because their reward has been so out of line with what they can achieve elsewhere. So that's the kind of area of concern.
Morale, in other words.
Morale is certainly an issue, but I think also, when I talk to people, and we do a lot of, careful exit interviews, a lot of analysis of that, if people are leaving because they've got promoted or because they feel they've achieved what they want to the Cabinet Office, they're going back to work and home or something, I say fine. If it's because they feel frustrated that they couldn't work in the way that they wanted to work, that it was burdensome, or that they didn't have a good team that they were part of, or that they could double their pay by working elsewhere, even in the public sector, those things I take more seriously, because that feels like a talent loss that we'd like to avoid.
And does it remain a concern to you that morale could impact upon recruitment and retention? Or do you think, in the light of the survey, that is less likely?
I think the big improvements in the survey are indicative that we've got a happier workforce and a place that people would be even more keen to work in. But we're not complacent about that. We also recognise that a lot of people in the Cabinet Office under terrific strain. The experience, I've got members of staff who literally rolled off from EU exit work to COVID to dealing with the consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that has been pretty relentless. So there are people there who've been under great pressure and strain. I'm also really conscious that a lot of people have been bearing the cost of living, and particularly for our less well-paid staff, that is a very major consideration. So those are both the kind of the burden and pressure of work and the competitiveness of our pay we remain very focused on. In our second year of a better Cabinet Office, because we are going to continue it in this calendar year, we are going to be, as well as the themes we had before, we're adding a new one around operational effectiveness, which is to try and simplify the way of working to reduce, if you like, the on-costs of work, the sort of admin, the bureaucracy, because people obviously do want to serve ministers, they want to serve the public, and they want to do that in as light and easy a way as possible. And so we're going to try and have a real push on that to try and help from a retention perspective. I think the other thing, just as an aside, I know the committee joined us when we were up in Glasgow, and that debate we had in Glasgow University, and I've been twice before the student bodies in not just Glasgow University but Strathclyde University, as part of our effort to try and raise our profile in Scotland and Glasgow specifically, and attract people into the civil service. And after each of these events, people have formed a big queue to say, like, how do we join? This sounds so interesting and so worthwhile, and you work on such important stuff. So I do think that the mission of the Cabinet Office, right at the centre of government, trying to deal with all the incoming situations and deliver the priorities of the government of the day, is exciting work that people do think is interesting and worthwhile being part of. And I do recognise that myself.
Well, we look forward to seeing the results of the survey within the timescale you've just indicated. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Damien Moore, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, Sir Alex. In the committee's report on the Civil Service People Survey, it recommended that the Cabinet Office publish further detail on its progress in delivering a better Cabinet Office programme. Previously, some of the evaluation has been vague, but given that, can you give us some more detail? And also, would you say that the first phase of a better Cabinet Office programme has achieved what you would hoped?
Yes, just to give a little bit of variety to the hearing, perhaps I could invite my colleague Sarah Harrison, Chief Operating Officer, Cabinet Office, to come in on that question. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. So the first phase is completed, and those people survey results that have just been referenced, which will be published very shortly, will show not only improvement across all the key themes that go to making up the overall engagement score for the people survey, but will also show progress in relation to delivery of the first phase of the Better Cabinet Office programme. Just a couple of examples I might pick out, if I may. First is the progress in relation to leadership and managing change. Leadership was one of the important themes of our 6 in the first phase of our Better Cabinet Office programme. Another example is learning and development. It's very important for this department to invest in our skills and capabilities. Alex has referenced the heterogeneity of the work of the department, and vital that we get our learning and development programme right and tailored to our colleagues. And over the course of last year, we've seen something like 7,500 different colleagues engaging in around about 250 different events. That is, in addition to that, will be the series of professional development that colleagues will have pursued. So again, our learning and development theme in Better Cabinet Office, you will see some improvement in our people survey engagement in relation to learning and development. I would also draw out, if I may, the importance of, given the reference to morale, of the increase in the people survey in staff reporting the Cabinet Office as a great place to work, and indeed a place for the development of their career progression. And I think perhaps as we move into the second phase of the Better Cabinet Office programme, year 2, another theme that you will see in the results is the confidence with which staff see action having been taken in relation to the 2022 People Survey results, and even more confidence that action will be taken in relation to the 2023 People Survey results. And those results from 2023 are feeding directly into the second phase of our Better Cabinet Office programme, and we've got the pleasure of joining our staff at an in-person and hybrid event tomorrow, hosted both in London, in York and in Glasgow, to set out the next phase of the Better Cabinet Office programme.
So are you able to provide more detail on your plans for this second phase, and also when you expect to implement them?
Yes, so we haven't waited to make progress on shaping the programme. As you referenced, the People Survey results were shared with staff in December, and we've used the period between December and, in effect, tomorrow's presentation of our plan to build those themes. They are the 6 themes that were a feature of the first year of the work, which is basically leadership, purpose and values, workplace and technology. Sorry, forgive me, I just immediately remember the respect and pay, of course, and progression were the sort of key themes for the first year. We've maintained those 6, added 2, as Alex referenced, organisational effectiveness. But perhaps more specifically, if I could just draw out some sort of sub-areas of focus for us in year 2, they are very much to go further in relation to our work on purpose and values in the Cabinet Office. They are to continue to address the root causes of bullying, harassment and discrimination, which remains a focus for us in the department. They are to invest in exceptional leadership and line management. So in phase 1 of the programme, we did quite a lot of work on building line management capability, and we will sustain that into year 2. We've also, as we bridge from year 1 to year 2, launched a new leadership development programme, so that will be an important theme. And the last 4 areas, just to focus on, are continued work on progression and the development of careers within the Cabinet Office, building on the progress made in year 1. Optimising our hybrid working model. We are a department made up of around about 7,000 staff in the core department. 2,400 of our staff are based across the United Kingdom and outside London, and of course that is the direction of travel as we move towards meeting our places for growth targets and beyond. So therefore working effectively in that hybrid way is really important. A link to that is strengthening the regional leadership and engagement of our staff. And then the last area of focus specifically is what we call colloquially corporate services sludge busting. So in other words, removing where appropriate some of the bureaucracy to give people elbow room and to get out of the way to enable our staff to perform at their very best.
Could I just quickly ask one point on managing performance, because obviously very many people who go in and do a really good job often see the very minority that don't as something which does cause a bit of an issue. Is there any plans around working effectively to eliminate some of that and managing the performance around those that are not performing to optimum levels?
Yes, I mean, I think, I suppose, first of all, our investment in good quality line management, which implicit within that, or explicit, I should say, is the importance of, managing performance, both strong and able performance to create the space to encourage the growth of skills and capability and see further progression, as well as tackling poor performance, and then also a real focus on our leadership development as well. So that puts the foundations in place, and then, of course, associated with that is the work on an ongoing basis to conduct regular performance management processes, which are very much a feature of the department, as they are for many others. And we will, continue to look where we can at further ways to improve that performance reporting process. It's quite rich at the moment in that you draw upon 360 feedback and other elements of feedback in conducting those performance processes, but we need to move to a much more kind of continuous level of engagement, particularly through improved line management, to encourage and drive up further improvements in our underlying performance.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. John MacDonald, please.
Can I declare a non-pecuniary interest? I'm a member of the PCS Trade Union Parliamentary Group. A non-pecuniary interest. Can we talk about the People's Survey and pay? Okay. Last time you were with us, we went through the survey, and at that point, the satisfaction levels on pay more dissatisfied than at any other period since the survey began. Has that improved?
Yes, it has.
Dramatically?
It has, right across the piece. I mean, I wouldn't say it's yet very strong, but it is a dramatic improvement year on year from what was a very low base, as you rightly say. That was an exceptionally poor year. And you remember the circumstances when we went through a little bit, the evidence last year that the pay remit was fixed in March, and then, of course, over the course of the year, a lot more inflation came into the system. So some of the other public sector workforces, their pay was fixed over the course of the summer, which took more account of those increase in cost of living. So when we were, you remember myself and Deputy Prime Minister were before you in January of that year, and we were looking hard at what the pay remit should be. And as he said at the time, we were very conscious of the impact of those costs of living on people. After that, you saw that the pay remit we put in place for the year following was 5.5%, which obviously was the biggest increase that I'd had for, I think, 2 decades. And then there was then an additional payment of £1,500 as a kind of one-off cost of living payment to delegated grades.
Alex, if you can give us a favour, have you gone up to near the 39% or are you near the 28%?
Or
it was on pay, satisfaction with pay and benefits. It fell from 39% to 28%. Are you near the 39 or the 28?
Near the 39, yeah.
So you've moved up a bit. Yep, okay. The concern, I don't know whether you've seen the latest report submitted as part of the pay round from Queen Mary University.
Queen Mary, I've seen the PCS one.
Yeah, it was in the pay round last week, I think, submitted to the Minister and yourselves. Because on the pay satisfaction, what's come out of that is a more, I suppose, I think quite objective analysis of where people are at on pay. Mm-hmm. And you can see why it's, because 39, even if we're near 39%, it's still pretty low in terms of satisfaction and does have implications for morale. And just to give you a flavour of it, they're basically saying the civil service has gone from an above average pay occupation in 1970 and 80 to below average pay. Since 2010, median annual pay has fallen, it depends on what grade and inflation intake you say, between 15 and 38%. Mm-hmm. And now we're in a situation where, as a result of statute, when the minimum wage goes up, so do pay rates. Yep. And we're now, as a government, a minimum wage employer to a large extent in many areas. And that's impacting upon differentials as well. So differentials are closing down. The concern that obviously I think all of us have got, employers and trade unions, is the impact that is having on morale in the long term. Yep. What long-term process or what steps do you see being taken now to resolve that issue? Because it clearly does impact upon morale, because even if there's been improvement, it's still pretty low, and that will eventually impact, or if it may have already, in terms of recruitment and retention.
Yep. In short, I agree. Those are really important issues, and you rightly say that in real terms, pay hasn't improved, and indeed has gone down in real terms for all but the AA grade. That's been pulled up by the national minimum wage. That's the findings, not just of our own work, but the National Audit Office, in a report for Parliament has shown that. If you add into that the sort of total compensation package, because obviously the pension is more generous for civil servants than it is for many other workforces, that does mean that the overall package is more competitive. I think up to HEO, beyond HEO, even including that, the misalignment comes back in. So I think what that points to is that we clearly do have big issues on our reward strategy. They haven't tended to be issues which are kind of acute in the sense that we have been able to recruit and hold on to people. We haven't had big deficits according to pay, but over time, I think that they do risk eating into people's commitment to the attractiveness of the civil service as a place to commit for many years or your whole career. You've got people who perhaps feel a bit anxious or resentful about that. So the people plan, which we've just published in January, does at the centre of it recognise that we need to have a proper new reward strategy which looks pretty root and branch at the whole issue of reward, probably including within that the balance of reward over people over time, because pension is a big chunk of the reward thing, but that is not necessarily where people's priorities would be at different stages of their life. So that should be part of it. Obviously, we have a sort of a London pay system, and we have a rest of the country pay system, and we have it delegated so individual employers have the right to vary within that remit. All of those things, I think, need to go into the mix again for a hard consideration as to whether or not we got the system working right. And obviously, I'm very aware. I know that PCS and other unions have also said, we need a framework for that, a national bargaining framework, and that is their view. Hasn't been the government's view, but I recognise that's what they have been pushing for.
On the 2 points you raised there, is there a clarity about within the strategy there needs to be some form of catch-up because of the erosion since 2010? And the second point that you raised then, when we had the Secretary of State before us, he made reference to addressing the point you just made about the national bargaining. He said he was going to look at his concern about what he described as the balkanisation of the pay negotiations, and that he was looking to see what reforms could be brought forward there so there could be less pay negotiation bodies, but consolidation of that. Has that moved on?
Certainly, I mean, I remember him saying that the Minister of the Cabinet Office had a lot of dialogue with the different national unions, and that is true that he did, and I was in some of those meetings, and that was very important, and actually we really appreciated the insight, not just opinion, but also evidence and data from consultations with their members and the evidence, the impact. That was really helpful to us, so just to recognise that very much. On the catch-up aspect, I know this is often entered into pay negotiations, not just amongst civil servants, but other public service workforces. I think you do need to pay attention to that trend over time. Whether you can catch up a lot of ground lost from a previous era, in a time of constrained public resources is probably a real question, I have to say, around affordability. But certainly I felt the £1,500 payment was expressly to try and recognise that our workforces had to suffer cost of living impacts which hadn't been recognised when the pay remit had been set originally.
The problem is on the minimum wage position, you're faced with another industrial relations problem unless that's addressed, because you are becoming this minimum wage employer at such a low level and differentials are eroding. Can we move on then? Can we move on to headcounts then? The government at one stage announced that they wish to return to the headcount to pre-COVID levels. So roughly, I think, about 70,000 reduction overall. When we had the Secretary of State before us recently, again, there was a commitment that there would be at least a reduction in headcount overall. Do we know where that's got to now? And within Just take your own situation in terms of the department. You've reduced the headcount, but you're actually paying more for temporary staff, and is that good value for money?
Taking each of those questions in turn, first of all, you're exactly right that the government has a strong aspiration to reduce the overall number of people working in the civil service, first of all, to get back to sort of pre-pandemic levels, 2019, and ultimately back to 2016, which I think was the low point in headcount numbers of the post-war era. They've stated that intention. They've also recognised that there are huge demands for public services, and being short of staff, can contribute to backlogs and the other shortfalls in the services that citizens expect. So to reconcile those two positions, two things. First of all, what the Deputy Prime Minister said before this committee when we were there together, or here together in January, was the way in which we're seeking to achieve this is by having better ways of working and more efficient ways of working. I kind of restate that's the most important thing. Just having fewer people is going to lead to less good public services unless you can improve the efficiency of the way in which people work. So that must be exactly right. On the absolute numbers, you may have seen that the Chancellor announced in autumn of last year that the restated government ambition was to make sure that there wouldn't be any net growth over the remainder of the spending round period in the total headcount of the civil service. That, I think, was recognising that we would need both to add new people, but potentially could lose people in other areas. So it's not a recruitment freeze. We'd be continuing to recruit, but that overall the net numbers should not increase over that period, but also recognising that some departments would be getting bigger, others getting smaller. So I think that brings us up to date on where we've got to on that. Some
departments where it's acknowledged there's understaffing, DWP in particular.
I think that DWP have been looking to add the number of work coaches. They've been getting very good returns on those. Obviously incredibly important to get people into employment, in some cases back into employment. So that's an area of growth they have. You'll be familiar that obviously the Home Office have been adding more people in dealing with asylum cases. The Ministry of Justice have found that they needed to employ more people in the prison service. They'd actually lost a number of people in the prison service during the COVID era, etc. So those have been areas of net growth, relatively few and quite targeted. Turning to the Cabinet Office and your question there about our headcount numbers, comparing the end of September 23 with the end of September 22, which is the all reported in the annual civil service employment survey, we actually, I think, have reduced just about 500 FT in that time frame. Most of those reductions came from people who had finished the work they were working on, the programs we'd kind of rolled out of particular things. We try, we take on new responsibilities, we have to kind of finish them and let them go or return to departments, etc. So that was, cyclical and efficiency based. You mentioned that we have employed in the year that you've got there for your accounts, for the year of the accounts we're looking at today, 22-23, we had increased the spend on contingent labour, which you're referring to. It's not in the same areas. The areas where we had needed to add additional contingent labour were, first of all, in the government digital service. That our model for delivering one login, which is the new digital identity program we have, involves a mixture of consultants, contractors and civil servants. We try and make it as many civil servants as possible and are increasing that over time. But because it's mission critical, it's a service that will affect 25 million citizens, we also did want to take on board people who had prior experience in digital identity and so on. So that was one area. We also had contingent labour in relation to property specialists working in the Government Property Agency, and we had some temporary staff to help dealing with the surge in demand for government recruitment service and for UK security vetting. Overall, our costs, as you rightly say, increased by, I think, about £8 million in relation to... 9.8. Thank you very much. In terms of the use of contingent labour. if you compare the reduction of the cost of having about 500 FTE, that is probably saving us about 35 million. So they're not the same people, but I just emphasise that overall our measures to control efficiency and expenditure and have no more staff than we needed to, and only to use contingent labour where it is useful and where it's clear value for money to do so, have been successful. And also looking at consulting expenditure, we were able to reduce that by almost exactly £8 million in comparing the 2 years together.
Related to that, the exit packages gone up dramatically, haven't they, compared to the previous year? Why have so many exit packages been agreed? I'll just give you the figures. The Cabinet Office Group granted 182 exit packages during 2022 and 23. That was 4.4 million. 21-22, it was only 10.
Yes, you're right that is an increase, admittedly on a small base. Just to kind of give you the scale of that as an activity, so that's about 4.4 million, is about 0.6% of our net pay costs, so it's not big in the overall scheme of things. The reason for the increase in terms of number of cases, particularly large number of relatively small cases there, which draw attention to, is nearly all special advisors. So £3 million of that 4.4 million was payments to special advisors. You may remember in that year we had a considerable level of change in political leadership, and special advisors serve coterminous with their political...
This is paying off PAGs, is it?
And when special advisors who lose employment...
There's Dominic Cummings amongst all this then?
It might be in the previous year's accounts.
Okay, fair enough. Okay. Just on a serious point, the staff turnover figures are quite dramatic, aren't they? I was looking at this turnover rates. Yep. I think the Institute of Government came in for a discussion about this as well. Yep. 28.2% compared to the average of 11.9% across the civil service. Yep. Are you concerned about the high levels of staff turnover? Because it does have some impact upon the capability of the department.
Yes, I mean, we would be, we're not concerned when people who've done their job finish it and move on. So within 22-23, for example, people who had previously worked on the COVID task force was disbanded. People who worked on COP26, that was nearly 180 people who were working on the G7 summit in the year of presidency that we had in the UK. All those people rolled off those tasks. So I say, great, that's good turnover. Also, we have people who, within the overall figures, we have fast streams, and it's part of the model for developing fast streams that they move every year. Yeah. These are the fast streams across the whole of government count against the Cabinet Office. So those are areas where you'd expect us to have a higher level of turnover. As I was trying to say in answer to the questions from Damien Moore previously, the type of turnover that we don't want is when people who would like to stay working with us choose not to because they find it not a great place to work, or their skills not used, or the pay issue.
Understandably, in our organisation. So if you took that into account, the completion of tasks, etc., what would your percentage be? It wouldn't be the 28.2. What would it be, do you think?
Stripping it out, I think you've got that.
Yeah, so the figure that probably is most comparison to the rest of the civil service and the way you describe is actually about 14.8%.
Right, so just a higher than...
And that's down itself from about 17% 2 years ago. So the direction of travel, both at a gross level, if I could put it that way, in other words, including fast streamers, government commercial professionals who are on our payroll but obviously serving in other departments, special advisors that we've mentioned earlier are in that gross figure. So if the direction of travel there is down, and the focus particularly on turnover internally is around 14.8% at the moment, and that direction is going down as well.
Okay, thanks. It'd be worth, for the future, making sure we're aware of that, because otherwise the figures don't accurately reflect the department's operations, does it? Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. Ronnie Cowan, please.
Thanks, Chair. I want to look at consultancy, and really I'm curious about what we're spending money on, where we're spending money on, and the effect that's having in the civil service. And just for some background, prior to 31st of January 2023, government bodies seeking to spend on consultancy services were required to obtain Cabinet Office approval for contracts with a duration of more than 9 months and or with total cost exceeding £600,000. That's been discontinued. Is there a limit in there, and why did we scrap that limit?
So there's a couple of different things there. So internally within the Cabinet Office, we have a very robust process for testing all consultancy expenditure. It goes through a Cabinet Office Approvals Board, which subjects all consulting spend to assessment for value for money, whether or not we could not do it internally, whether this is the best firm to be using for it, whether we have got, we're compliant with the consultancy playbook and therefore make sure there's proper knowledge transfer taking place, etc. etc. That includes NEDs as well as executives, and then recommendations go forward to ministers. So a great deal of scrutiny and assessment is given to any consulting spend, and that's, I'm sure, one of the reasons why we're able to reduce it so substantially from 29 million 21-22 to 21 million 22-23, a big reduction. Across the wider civil service, we also apply a system called Cabinet Office Controls, which is actually a delegation of the expenditure controls of the Treasury, and on their behalf, we we scrutinise major expenditures, major new contracts, and both for commercial procurement, for digital, we have the same for property controls, we also do marketing controls, major projects, all of those go through these assessment type processes. As part of that, when we were looking at the overall weight of admin and bureaucracy in government, we were saying, hang on, people are spending enormous amounts of time and effort in this activity, and in many cases it's already had to go through a kind of a departmental sign-off. It's had to go to their investment committee, they've had to assess it, it's been signed off by their senior people, by their ministers.
This is tremendously expensive. It sounds tremendously expensive.
Yeah, so because that level of control, we judged that it has a cost, it has a value, so we looked hard and said, could we have as many of the benefits as possible with a reduced cost, and we were able to. This is an exercise led by...
So to go back to my original question, at what point does this operation kick in? If you're looking for a consultancy, at what point do you have to go through all these loops to justify the administration and the paperwork to say, let's grant that contract?
You're exactly right. So previously I think the threshold had been set at quite a low level, and we were able to, through an exercise, to say, taking each one of those controls, what's a more proportionate approach, and through that we were able to reduce by about 80% the volume of those Cabinet Office controls. That's, if you like, the second assessment point. So the department's already approved it, then goes to the Cabinet Office for a second approval. So 80% by volume of those cases without affecting, if you like, by I think it's by less than 10% or 15%. The value of cases looked at. So the long tail of relatively small cases, we are saying, is it really worth the second opinion? Is it just another bit of bother to go through on a case where the amounts at stake are not great? That's why we, with the led by the Minister of the Cabinet Office and the Chief Secretary at the time, in 22, we went through that exercise. We then did a study with the help of auditors a year later to say, have we taken on any more risk as a consequence? Is this proportionate? Are we missing anything? They found actually we're giving more attention to the bigger cases and the more risky cases, so that was a net gain. So I'm actually pleased with that as an improvement in the system of control we put in place.
What are we spending consultancy on?
We spend consulting in government across lots of different areas, and the classic way to use consultants is for specialist skills that it doesn't pay the civil service to have permanently on tap. So, in our case, I mentioned in response to questioning from John MacDonald that, for example, we have had to build a new system for digital identity management, so anybody accessing government services, rather than having each time to re-identify themselves and say, this is who I am, and I can prove that, and here's my address, and here's my date of birth, and all that you have a reusable system. So pretty important part of digital government, very vital to public service delivery. That obviously needs to be built to a very high standard of robustness, usability, security, scalability, and we did that with a combined team of consultants, contingent labour and internal civil servants.
Are you happy in that sort of process you've outlined there? The knowledge from the consultants you have brought in has now been passed on to the permanent staff within the civil service? That's
exactly right, and that's one of the conditions that we have as part of what's called the consultancy playbook, which is how to do this best, as a piece of kind of best practice guidance issued by the commercial teams in the Cabinet Office. And a key condition of that is to say, look, fair enough that you might be able to try and get consulting advice or contingent labour from people who have worked on digital identity systems before and perhaps implemented them in other administrations or in other contexts, but that we don't want to be in a situation where we always have to go back for real expertise externally and pay the premium for that. We want those skills to be internally held. But just to reassure you on that, if you look at the overall picture of government expenditure on consultants, not only has that enormously reduced, so 21-22 was 1,596 million across government, 22-23 was 1,187 million or 88 million, so about £400 million reduction year on year, which I think does show very close attention to value to money, trying to reduce reliance on external consultants. And the flip side of that has been building up our internal resources. We've been able to increase over that year by several thousand the number of people in government with deep skills in digital data and technology. And that is because we see that as a core skill for government, and not something where you need to rely on external people, but something where our own people need to be exceptionally adept in that.
So at one point we're creating what is termed the Crown Consultancy. That's been ditched. So do you think the methods you're using now is more cost effective and more efficient?
Yes, there are different aspects that we as a kind of experiment, we put in place a Crown Consultancy for about a year and a half to see whether or not we could have a group of people who are able to substitute for the work of consultants, but working in government with consulting backgrounds and skills. I found that quite difficult to do, partly because the range of different activities that government undertakes is hard to replicate in a small hub of consultants, even though they were very good. Also, that I think the highest value add from their activity was in the kind of triage function, which was, are you sure you already need to do this? Is there a better way? Why don't you just use consultants for this piece of the work, but not for that piece? And show me how the knowledge transfer is occurring. But that we have actually embedded those practices in the consultancy playbook, which all departments have to follow now.
Not everybody's a fan. I mean, Lord Agnew suggested that the excessive reliance on consultants has infantilised the civil service. Do you agree?
Lord Agnew was part of that process of trying to challenge excessive use of consultants, and I think that the reduction year on year in 400 million, it was partly due to his work as well as that of others. So I very much support that. I think that what lies behind his comment there is that a sense in which, if for the amazingly talented people we have working in the civil service, if they see the hardest, most exciting work being given lock, stock and barrel to external consultants who are paid a premium, then that indeed could have an effect on morale and engagement, willingness to serve over time, which is why we need to make sure that we only use consultants in exceptional cases with specialist skills on a temporary basis and achieve the knowledge transfer that you mentioned at the beginning of your question.
So you bring in a consultancy, digital imprint or whoever, are they under contract not to then poach your staff?
I think that probably most standard terms do include what's called non-solicitation. Yes, that you are to do that, yeah.
Poaching staff, same thing. You're comfortable you can bring in a consultancy, any consultancy.
Yeah.
You could help pass on that knowledge to the civil service, and then they're not going to start saying, oh, we'll have you and you out the civil service. You're comfortable with your contracts are tight enough.
Yeah, and I haven't come across such cases, I must say.
Thanks, Raj.
Thank you very much. Tom Randall, please.
Thank you, Chairman. So I just wonder if I could ask about spending first.
Yep.
The figures in the annual report show a planned £2 billion capital spend.
Yep.
But it's my understanding that the supplementary estimates memorandum doesn't show that planned expenditure. So can I first of all ask, is it the case that there is going to be a £2 billion capital expenditure?
Could I take the chance to bring variety on my other side? I've got the Chief Financial Officer of the department next to me, and he would love a chance to try and explain the difference between those two numbers.
Thank you very much. The supplementary estimate memorandum from January of this year is by far the most up-to-date forecast in the public domain of what we will spend in the next financial year. I think that the question relates to Appendix A in the 2023 accounts. Now, what Appendix A in the 2023 accounts contains is the Treasury OSCA contained forecasts of government's expenditure over the lifetime of the SR. So for SR21, of which next year will be the third year, that is, in relative terms, quite an old number. And that's based on the main estimates that we thought in 2021 would be in place in 24-25. So if I were to look at capital, which is your question, our forecast for capital in 24-25, the increase really was an estimate of the impact of an accounting change. During that time, started in 2023, in 22-23, we introduced the IFRS 16. Now, IFRS 16, as the committee I'm sure is aware, changed the rules for what counts as a capital asset and what counts as capital expenditure. So previously, you treated leases if you owned the building. IFRS 16 says if you have control of the building, then you must treat that as capital expenditure. That's a major undertaking. And our early estimate of that suggested that the impact was going to be £2 billion. That was far too high. Actually, as the accounts show, the impact in 2022-23 was £775 million, so less than half of that. So I'm expecting 24-25's capital expenditure, which is still the subject of active discussion in government and with Treasury, to be far closer to the what's in the supplementary estimate memorandum for this year at about between 600 and 700 million pounds. So the drawback, I'm afraid, of Appendix A is that it is the old main estimate at the start of the spending review period. It is, however, still a really useful disclosure, as it allows the reader of the accounts to track the change in actual public spend from the spending review announcement. It also explains why there was such a decrease in revenue expenditure in Ardell, which I'd be happy to explain if the committee would like.
Well, that's a very sort of comprehensive answer, so thank you for that. Just as a non-accountant, just to confirm that this change in numbers doesn't mean that any projects have been shelved.
No, absolutely not. Not in and of itself. Now, of course, the actual capital programme, which should include the GPA Hubs programme, different buildings would have been built at slightly different times as work was brought forward and moved back. So it's not exactly the same. But the drop of 2 million to cash spend of 600 million is not because a very large project was cancelled. It was because in 2021 we were estimating the impact of an accounting change without even knowing which leases would have been onboarded onto the Government Property Agency. Now, what really drives the difference is the Cabinet Office consolidates the Government Property Agency into its accounts, and the Government Property Agency is fundamentally a property management and leasing business. So small changes in the GPA, proportionally for the Cabinet Office, could have big swings in the balance sheet, and particularly big swings relating to the exact timing of IFRS 16 charges. But the straight answer is no. This doesn't represent a halving of the capital programme in the Cabinet Office.
And in a similar vein, the annual report shows the Cabinet Office facing a 50% cut in the administration budget in the next financial year. But again, the supplementary estimates memo shows a much more modest fall. So what cut is the Cabinet Office actually facing?
So the published SR settlement showed a £30 million drop in what I would call core funding. However, for all of the Cabinet Office and the Cabinet Office group, which is the consolidated figures, we would also include the increase in spend that relates to onboarded properties within the GPA. Specific funding relating to the Hubs programme, specific funding relating to the size of the public inquiries, the COVID inquiry, and changes in that expenditure would consolidate up. But also particularly central digital investment around one login or investment in AI would count in the Cabinet Office. So The published drop in the main estimate of about £30 million as part of a spending review may well be offset if the government decides to make further investment, particularly in digital or the Hubs programme. Broadly, I expect the Cabinet Office to be spending far closer to the £900 to £1 billion as disclosed in the 2023 accounts than the earlier 2021 forecast of what the main estimate would be, which is closer to half that.
Okay, so I understand. So the 50% cut. I mean, that's not because is that sort of a remotely achievable figure, or?
Unfortunately, what Appendix A that you are comparing correctly, the 50% reduction to, was the 2021 estimate of main estimates. Right. Now, for the Cabinet Office, there's many fantastic things about the Cabinet Office, and one of which is proportionately how much of his expenditure turns up in supplementary estimates. And the memorandum describes many of those examples. So we don't have funding for the inquiries in our main estimate. We don't have funding that relates to support from CCS dividends in the main estimate. So even on a comparable year, we would expect that the main estimate is increased enormously by at least 50% just through the course of normal business in the supplementary estimate. So you will always, unfortunately, see a big difference between what the forecast main estimate is for the Cabinet Office and what is then confirmed in the supplementary estimate. Now, for some of those cases, I think that's just and right and proper. The COVID inquiry is a statutorily independent inquiry. Within the bounds of managing public money, the Secretary and the Chair will say, well, this is what our plan is going to be, and that's known during the year. So it's just and right and proper that the actual funding for that is agreed during the year through supplementary estimates, even though Treasury's cover is provided to start. That's, I think, just one of the peculiarities of the Cabinet Office. It's true for all departments, but proportionately much, much larger for this department.
And you've given there some quite sort of varied examples, and Sir Alex, and you're sort of open the breadth of the work that the office is doing. Given those sort of those variables, that sort of uncertainty, those changes, does that make long-term planning on the Cabinet Office's finances viable, really, in terms of?
So I would say that all departments carry with them a degree of complexity. And what it does mean is that where we have long-term plans of what we need to achieve, the complexity of the finances means that we have to have some really active, open discussions with the Treasury on a month-by-month basis as to what a good position would be. So a very good example would be the One Login programme, a fantastic programme of investment in digital capabilities. Now, there's a very, very good business case for that, which showed that broadly what we would be doing over the 3 years of the SR. But for such a complex programme, we knew that we would maybe need to move money from one year to the next, or maybe make revenue, what was going to be revenue and spend, was actually going to produce an intangible asset and should be regarded as CDEL. So in those situations, we have really open conversations, and the Treasury allow us to move money between years, just within the ring fence of One Login. So where we can't nail down exactly how much we're going to spend in every year respecting annularity, the compensating control of that is a very active management of the position within Treasury rules as reflected in the supplementary estimate. So the compensation for uncertainty is active management and agility.
Just finally from me, on the Cabinet Office's priority outcomes, it has 5, as I understand it, and there is arguably a sort of imbalance in spending in that 12% of total expenditure goes towards the delivery of 3 of those priority outcomes. So why is it that the department spends proportionately so little on some of its priority outcomes, and does that reflect the priority accorded to them? No,
it doesn't. So a very good, but I do understand I do understand why it does seem to jar, why it does seem to be a dissonance. So a very good example would be the Cabinet Office's role to support equalities, to support the agenda for diversity and inclusion. Now, the majority of the spend that we record on that is around the Equalities Unit and the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, which together is about £21 million. Now, that means that the direct spend on that is a very small amount. However, it has its own commission. We deliver supporting the Cabinet Office delivers supporting the different ministers for equality for women and for disabilities. So that, in political terms, is enormous priority. There are ministers just for that priority, even though the spend and the organisation dedicated to that is relatively small. So we have in the Cabinet Office a minister and a ministerial team that's dedicated to Veterans Affairs, even though the spend on that is relatively small. So in many cases with the Cabinet Office, the total level of spend is not necessarily an indicator of the bandwidth, importance, impact that the Cabinet Office brings through its convening power across government and public sector. It is also still able to sponsor legislation and to intervene. Again, not measured by how much Ardell or Seedale is appointed to that. But I do understand how it does seem to jar or contradict, quite so.
Thank you.
Thank you. Damien Moore.
Thank you, Chairman. A year ago, you told us that new outcome delivery plans were being produced ready for the new financial year, but you're still reporting against the previous ones. Why is that?
I said we would be producing new outcome delivery plans for the new financial year, and we did. All departments did so, with the sole exception of those departments who are going through machinery government changes. You remember that was February of last year, so they were not able to produce them at the beginning of the year because so many other things were changing, but they did later in the year. So outcome delivery plans, just as I predicted, were put in place for all departments and were used to hold departments to account through the ordinary processes over the course of the year. And new ones are being updated now for the year ahead.
So, but where they're not there, how can we report against plans that are sort of obsolete? And I know that the Chair through this committee has obviously been very direct in the fact that it reduces our ability to scrutinise if something's not up to date.
So just to emphasise that new plans are produced every year. The issue that you're referring to is whether or not those are published. And I know that the Chair did indeed correspond with the Minister of the Cabinet Office and the Chief Secretary last summer on that issue.
Given that they have been produced, will they be published?
They haven't been published this year or the year before. No final decision, I think, has been taken about next year, but we'll have to wait and see.
And who's going to make that decision?
Those decisions are for ministers.
We might have to write and find out then.
Right, thank you. David Jones, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Sir Alex, you'll probably recall that at a previous attendance by you before this committee, I raised with you the issue of the expenditure incurred by the Cabinet Office on the legal representation for the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson in connection with the Committee of Privileges investigation into him. And I asked you if you ever thought a ministerial direction was appropriate, and you said not, given that there were precedents for this sort of expenditure. The Controller and Auditor General subsequently expressed some doubt about that, saying that although there was precedent for expenditure, it was precedent in connection with public inquiries, and that the Committee of Privileges investigation was of a wholly different nature. In the light of that, do you think that you should have sought a ministerial direction for that expenditure?
No, I stand by my position. Can I just set it out a little bit further if it's helpful to the committee? So I think the principle we're talking about here is for former ministers to get legal advice on the performance of their previous ministerial functions. Very well established, and indeed many, if not all, of the ministers appearing before the public inquiries at the moment have availed of that. So that's been the case for many administrations. There's nothing novel, contentious or repercussive about it. The area of, if you like, debate with the NAO when they came to look at it very carefully, prompted, I think, by some inquiries from others, was the fact that the former Prime Minister was appearing before a parliamentary committee different in kind, requiring a new and fresh assessment compared to whether or not, compared to the instance where it was before a public inquiry. We said, no, we think that is just another instance of an established policy. The question from the NAO was it actually something new enough, novel enough to require a fresh look? So that's the area of debate. It's probably quite nuanced.
I think there's a borderline case.
The CNAG exactly describes it, and I think he's written up a very full way in the accounts so everyone can see. Borderline case, and for that reason, he said, look, first of all, I want to get a second opinion on that, and sought one from the Treasury, Director General for Public Expenditure there, and Treasury Office of Accounts. They looked into it and accepted our assessment that it was regular, i.e. not novel, contentious and repercussive. That was the view, you may recall, of the Permanent Secretary who first looked at this. It was my view, it was the view of the Chief Financial Officer beside me here, and as it turned out was also the view of the Treasury when they looked at it. So I think probably for all of those reasons, the NAOLC, in the having looked into it and also having looked very carefully at the processes we'd followed and saw that they have been done very correctly, both around procurement and legal advice and propriety and ethics had all been involved, and through all of that, wrote it all up, but clearly didn't qualify the accounts and is satisfied, therefore, that the expenditure was regular and that the accounts provide a true and fair account.
And I think I'm correct in saying that the Treasury took the view that it's for an accounting officer to make a judgment as to whether an item of expenditure is novel, contentious or repercussive. Is that right?
That's true, that's the initial assessment. However, they did go on a bit further and said, well, we looked at the evidence that was put forward in support of the precedents, and they were content with that it was regular expenditure for that reason. And that was the view of the Director General for Public Expenditure and the Treasury Officer of Accounts, obviously, who works closely with Parliament and across government to make sure that these things are done properly.
What are the total legal costs incurred to date?
I think according 260,000 rings a bell.
Yes.
Yeah, 260,000. I was just looking to check. Yeah.
Yes, I think that the figure set out was 263,000 in the annual report. It hasn't changed since then. It hasn't increased since then.
On that issue, was that the
advice for that? I think that's right. That's not changed.
Yeah.
So that is unchanged.
I think that's concluded. Obviously, the whole Privileges Committee matter is concluded. Obviously, the Prime Minister is also appearing before the COVID inquiry and has received legal advice as part of that, and that is ongoing.
That's a separate issue and of a separate character.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We're going to conclude our session there. There will be a number of supplementary questions which we'll be writing about, which can be dealt with through correspondence. But can I thank our three witnesses, and particularly Sir Alex for coming before us, what will be your last appearance. Thank you for your public service, and we wish you well with the future, whatever that holds for you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Order, order.
Meeting has ended. The proceeding 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 has ended.